Okay, well, thank you, Nick and Carmen, for joining us to have this discussion around understanding of genetics in pulmonary arterial hypertension. We know from our membership that it is something over, I would say, probably over the last 2 to 3 years and maybe the last sort of 12 months has gained a lot of traction and people are really interested in it. So just before we start talking about the sort of studies and the researches that I know both of you are very much involved in, Nick, could I ask you first and then Carmen to sort of just introduce yourselves, what your involvement is in genetics and any involvement with the world of pulmonary arterial hypertension?
Great, sure, thanks Ian. Yeah, so my name's Nick Morrell and I'm a professor at the University of Cambridge, and we've had a long-standing interest in the genetics of pulmonary arterial hypertension. I am a clinician and I look after patients with respiratory disease and pulmonary hypertension. But in the research lab, we're interested in the genetics and trying to discover how we might treat this disease better based on that kind of information, but also other useful genetic information derived from patients, for patients.
Yeah, Nick, not trying to sort of expose your age, just how long have you been involved in pulmonary hypertension?
Gosh, since about 1990, so
right,
nearly 30 years. Gosh.
Excellent. Surprising, isn't it? Yeah. And has your interest and involvement specifically with genetics been more recent than that?
Yeah, so ever since the first gene in pulmonary hypertension, the BMPR2 gene, was identified back in 2000, we switched most of our research into trying to understand the genetic basis of disease. So really, for the last 20 years, we've been working on those sorts of areas.
Okay, excellent. Carmen, would you like to introduce yourself as well and your involvement in this work?
Yeah, so I've been working with Nick for quite a long time, for the last 7 years on the IPH cohort study. But before that, I was at Papworth, and I think it was must be about 15 years ago, I started on a study that was called the genetics of pulmonary hypertension. And that really sort of gauged my interest into genetics, and I started working with Joanna, and then I started doing some clinical studies with our pulmonary hypertension patients. So hopefully some of you will remember me. But we got to, we're at this point where we really need to learn a lot more about the disease. We have drugs that are out there, but we really need to learn about the disease and go towards a more sort of personalized medicine, hopefully in the future, and hope genetics will be able to answer some of those questions for us. So I came from a very sort of, not much knowledge in genetics, and it's increased slowly over the years.
Okay. Nick, can I just ask you a very general question as you introduce yourself? Could you, and this might be, it's a general question, it might be a big question to try and answer in a simple terms, but when we talk about genetics, what do we actually mean genetics? What is this field?
So it's the contribution, sort of the inherited contribution to a disease. So although it isn't the case for all forms of pulmonary hypertension, of course, but for certain forms of PAH, we know that there is a major inherited contribution. And the size of that contribution is huge. So, if you carry a risk gene for pulmonary hypertension, the risk is something like 100,000 times greater than the rest of the population. So yeah, it's understanding these inherited factors which can increase your susceptibility to getting PAH.
Okay. And Nick, I'll sit with you on this one particularly, but what's in your sort of 20 years experience, and again, as simply or as complexly as you'd like, is what do we already know about the link between genetics and PAH?
Yeah, so we've known for many, many years, more than 50 or 60 years, that PAH can run in families. But if we consider that group of people, it's really very, very unusual, very rare, even within a rare disease. What we now know is that even people who don't have a family history of PAH can have an inherited form of the disease. And that's because not everybody who carries the gene for PAH actually develops the disease. You actually just have a hugely increased risk of developing the disease.
Okay. Carmen, can I ask you, because you talked about you being involved in the national cohort study, which is in essence what we're looking at today. What is this study? What is the national cohort study?
So the study has been running for 7 years, and we aim to recruit all patients who are either idiopathic or have heritable pulmonary hypertension, and also relatives of these patients as well. So what we aim to do is we see them at clinic, they're followed up annually as a part of their service appointment, and they have some bloods taken, and we collect all their clinical data in our database. So it's a longitudinal study, like I said, and it's mainly observational. So there's patients turn up at the clinic like they would normally, but we're really trying to answer those questions in pulmonary hypertension that we really don't know the answers to. You know, which patients do well, who responds to certain medicines, what are the markers, you know, and also we're hoping to recruit relatives of these patients. So like Nick said, there's a heritable part of pulmonary hypertension as well. So we're trying to look at what are the early signs of pulmonary hypertension in these relatives who go on to develop pulmonary hypertension, because most patients come to clinic and they've already got, you know, pulmonary hypertension is already manifested, and we try to treat them, but obviously it'd be better if we can try and treat these patients earlier.
Okay, can I actually just to explain, and forgive me for coming back on these, but you mentioned two things there. One, it is a longitudinal study. So what does longitudinal mean? And also you said it's an observational study. So firstly, what's a longitudinal study? What do you mean by observational?
So longitudinal just means that we see patients at relative sort of intervals. So with the IPH cohort study, we see patients at annual interviews. So we follow them up for 3 years. So that's what we mean by a longitudinal study. You have a visit at when you get diagnosed, or not diagnosed, when you get consented, then at 1 year, then at 2 years, and then 3 years, and then we call it a day after that. So it was really helpful for us. We can see we get blood samples all the way along and data, so we can see how disease is progressing in each individual. Some patients might be very stable during that period, whereas others might have a period where they'd be admitted to hospital and their pulmonary hypertension gets worse. We collect drug information as well, so we can see what drugs people are on, how they're responding to drugs as well. So it gives us such a big wealth of information, and then all that data is collected, like I say, visits from consent all the way through to 3 years, and we store those samples in our biobank in Cambridge.
Nick, can I ask you to describe what a biobank looks like? Because a bank to me is somewhere I put my money in and go and take it out if I've got any. So what is a biobank? And you know, because we talk about them quite a lot, but from my perspective and from people listening to this, might not quite sure what a biobank is.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's really quite remarkable because you know, these samples are coming from all across the UK, from all of the specialist pulmonary hypertension centres, coordinated by Carmen and Jennifer, our study coordinators. And the samples, you know, the patient or the relative provides a blood sample at the site. They're all put into different tubes, and they're then packaged up and sent across to this biobank in Cambridge, which literally is, you know, you go through a double door and you're into this sort of, you know, spaceship type room with ultra clean, with massive freezers in it and robotic machines that can put samples in the right place and then pull them out again. They're all barcoded, for example. So it's really kind of quite a high-tech thing. But it means that if a researcher then comes along and says, hey, I've got this really interesting idea about a new biomarker in pulmonary hypertension, we need this clinical information from the centres, we need this particular type of sample, because we store something like 7 or 8 different types of sample. The robot then goes off and finds these things and pulls them out and delivers them. We can deliver them to the researcher to address their question. So it's this incredible resource. Carmen, we now have what? 60,000 separate?
Over 60,000 samples. So for rare disease, this is very impressive.
Absolutely. Nick, you mentioned, you say a researcher comes along and says, I've got a biomarker I want to explore. What is a biomarker then? What does biomarker mean?
So this allows any researcher to look for a chemical or a signal in a blood sample, or blood cells that we can provide for them as well. So we're trying to ask questions like, you know, can we identify a simple thing that we can measure in the blood that might tell us about a patient's subsequent clinical course, or response to therapy, or anything else we're interested in, how their heart's working, for example. So if you could do that with just the blood test, potentially you could save an awful lot of additional investigation. So those are the sorts of things we're looking for as part of this study.
Okay. I mean, Carmen, I think it's incredible. I didn't realise there's 60,000 samples. This is over 7 years. That's incredible, isn't it? The network, I presume that's partly because of the network of care and treatment centres that we've got in the UK, and this collaborative working.
Definitely. I mean, we have 9 designated centres now all taking part in our study, and Great Ormond Street came on recently, providing us samples as well. But it really shows how well the designated centres work together, and obviously the principal investigators are involved with our study and work at each site. But we have a nurse at each site which sees the patient when they come in for their visits. And like I was saying before, it's an observational study, so they don't have any extra visits, no extra tests, the patients, no drugs, anything like that. So it doesn't impact much on their daily routine.
And Carmel, you said that Great Ormond Street now is involved in this. For people who might not know, Great Ormond Street is the centre that looks after children.
Yeah, that's right. So they've just recently sort of come on since September, and they've been recruiting paediatric patients. So this will be from birth up until the age of 16. They're seen at Great Ormond Street Hospital, and they're doing a great job. But we can also, at Great Ormond Street, they're recruiting relatives for us as well. It makes it quite easy for us to recruit relatives at Great Ormond Street because they're there obviously with their child. So we've been quite successful in recruiting relatives at the moment at Great Ormond Street as well, which has been great.
Excellent. So Nick, the sort of sample size that we've got in the work that's being developed, how does the UK then compare to the rest of the world globally? Are we second best?
Well, I'm biased, but I would say we're best. But we don't like to be too competitive. But actually, what it allows us to do is to work with our international partners now. So, we've got this fantastic network across the UK. We've got researchers in all different centres across the UK making use of this resource. But then we also reach out to international collaborators, the United States and Europe, for example, and we pull resources from their patients as well to enable us to do even more sort of impossible studies, or studies you may have thought were impossible a few years ago, because we can further increase the size of the samples that we're working with. And in this kind of game, having large numbers of volunteers into these studies and samples is key to success.
Okay, so in the 7 years that this cohort study, that's in the title, what have we learned new, Nick, do you think is at the top liners?
So the big things I'd say are that we have discovered new genes which cause PAH through this process, something like 5 or 6 new genes that we've discovered, which gives us new insights into understanding the disease, as well as important information for those patients and their families potentially. We have identified a range of these biomarkers, these sort of blood tests which can inform on prognosis and severity of disease and this sort of thing. So these are both proteins that circulate in the blood, or there might be bits of DNA or RNA, as people are now beginning to hear about with COVID vaccine, which we can measure in the blood as well. And all of these provide new insights and signatures into the disease. We've done, as well as all these sorts of genetic and sort of laboratory-based studies, we've done some what we call epidemiology studies. So through the study of this cohort, we're able to identify that diesel particles, for example, have an impact on the severity of PAH. So people living closer to busy roads, for example, with high diesel exposure seems to have an impact on their PAH. So we're able to do those sorts of studies as well as make use of the biobank.
Okay, and so you talk a lot there about understanding the disease much better, Nick, in this 7 years. Does that mean it might help us develop new treatments?
Yeah, for sure. the genetic studies that we've done point towards new treatments. But one of the things we are now beginning to do with the cohort is to use it as a platform or a basis in which to conduct clinical trials of new medicines. So the cohort recently just got funded for a Medical Research Council clinical trial of some new treatments that we have based on the genetic discoveries, which will use the cohort as a way of recruiting patients into the study. So that will be initiated. Unfortunately, it was held up due to COVID, but that will now be initiated in the new year.
That's got to be really exciting for people like yourself, Nick and Carmel, sort of doing this. The work really now is translating into potential treatments. That must be really quite pleasing and exciting.
It is. I mean, this has been a phenomenal effort from many people, not least the patients and the volunteers in this study. And it really is, beginning. It took a long time to get to this stage. I mean, it seemed like we were just collecting samples for a few years, but now we're really starting to reap the benefits of those efforts.
Yeah, I would just like to say thank you to all the patients as well. They're always happy to take part and give us extra bloods, and we've been supported by the PHA UK right from the beginning of doing cohort as well, obviously advertising our study for us and attending their conference. So it's having patients involved, it's having that support that makes a study and makes advances successful. So like Nick said, it's down to a lot of people helping us along the way.
I think we've got much. As you know, I'm also a nurse consultant in pulmonary hypertension working in Sheffield, and over the 25 years I've been engaged in pulmonary hypertension, I've seen going from no treatments to the proliferation of treatments. And the only way that that's been able to happen are people sticking their hand up and volunteering to take part in clinical trials and studies like this. So the future can only look different if people get engaged with this. And one of the things that we're hoping to do as an organisation working with people like yourself is to demystify some of the concerns that people have. So it's really excellent that we're working in this way now and in the future, that we want to see the rise and change in pulmonary hypertension. Hopefully sometime in the future, even a cure possibly for pulmonary hypertension. So either Nick or Carmen, at the moment, where would you say that we're at now with this cohort study? And thinking of the next 12 to 24 months, what are you wanting as the sort of leads in the studies to see happen? Yeah,
so maybe I can kick off and Carmen can contribute as well. So we have been delayed in this study by COVID, of course, like many other studies. But one of the priorities that we have over the priority we have over the next 18 to 24 months is really recruiting family members of patients with PAH, and particularly family members of patients who are already known to have a mutation in one of the genes. The reason why we want to do this is because we think it's very important to establish what the risk is for people who carry these mutations. They may be perfectly fine and they may stay perfectly fine forever, but clearly they are at considerable risk of developing this disease. And so we're offering the opportunity to follow those people up on an annual basis, to take blood samples and to hear from them if they experience any problems. And we're looking into ways in which we can do that in a bit more sort of dynamic way, perhaps by email, texts, mobile apps, all this kind of stuff, which we're trying to initiate over the next few months. So we see this as a really important part of the study. It'll also tell us an awful lot more than about how pulmonary hypertension first develops.
Yeah, like Nick was saying, we're really keen to recruit more relatives. It's an area that not much research has been done in. Should we be following up these relatives who have a known PH gene? Should we be following them up longitudinally? That's my favourite word, it seems to be. But should they have annual screening? We don't know. We don't know what to do with this group of relatives, and it's one of the missing parts of pulmonary hypertension that we're very much interested in. What happens from that period where a patient doesn't have pulmonary hypertension to when they come to clinic, normally 2 years later down the line, what's happened in those 2 years? We have no idea at the moment, and there's some research being done, but this would really help us to identify some key features in pulmonary hypertension and what triggers pulmonary hypertension in these relatives.
I wonder, Nick and Carmen, I'm thinking as you're talking whether this recruitment of relatives, etc., may be something that we could, perhaps in the new year, because we're in the middle of December, come back and do an infocast, particularly about how that might work, because there are all sorts of questions in it. But we'll continue this discussion. I'm not sure which one of you wants to pick this one up first, because you talk about relatives. What's the definition of a relative? Is it next of kin? Is it other brothers? How big is a relative pool?
Yeah, of course you can. Where do you end? We tend to confine it to what we call first degree relatives, okay, which is parents, children, brothers and sisters, aunts and uncles, perhaps at the most. But it's that sort of family tree, because otherwise it gets a bit unwieldy. But you're right. I mean, this is a very sensitive area to study. And it's fraught with all sorts of obstacles and issues, and part of it is around educating ourselves as PH professionals in terms of genetics and how to have these conversations with people and how to share information about the genetics of PAH, because it can be a sort of anxiety promoting area to talk about. And indeed, we don't have all the answers yet. It's part of the reason of doing this study, is to get some answers. But it is a very sensitive area. So we do understand that we always knew it's going to be a hard thing to do.
Okay. But Carmen, what's just as a general thing, during COVID, as Nick has mentioned, it's had an impact on all sorts of activities. Has that impacted on the ability to collect samples?
Yeah, very much so. Obviously, when we went into the first lockdown, there were no patients coming to clinic at all, so we were unable to collect blood samples. A lot of our nurses who were working on the study were obviously then going on to COVID with COVID drug studies as well. So we've been trying to follow up patients as they have come in. It's varied a bit from centre to centre. But what we're looking at the moment, like Nick said, is trying to follow up patients and relatives a bit more remotely. We can get great data by looking at their exercise, their daily exercise, what they do, rather than doing a 6-minute walk test at clinic. So following up these patients, we can do a lot remotely. People are so much more familiar with Zoom and other ways of communicating now. It's we have 9 designated centres. It's a long way for patients to come in sometimes. So if we can make things easier and get accurate data and do some of that over Zoom, we obviously still want to see our patients face to face, but in the interim we can still cover an awful lot and gain an awful lot of information.
Good. I mean, it has been, there's benefits, and it's difficult sometimes 9 months into COVID to see any benefit from COVID. But this ability to use technology, I mean, it's this interview that I'm conducting with you and Nick is through Zoom. It's as good as quality as anywhere else. We can translate a lot of things, information, enthusiasm, questions, etc. It's building that confidence. So it's an opportunity. Maybe one thing good that's coming out of COVID is accelerated the use of technology in a very positive way.
Yeah, and, people have jobs, so if you can follow them up remotely, it's so much easier. And like we said, we can gain an awful lot of information from these smart watches and apps, and people can download data as well. We have like insertable cardiac devices. That's a part of the IPH cohort study as well. So we can gain an awful lot of information without you coming to clinic, and things will change. Definitely over the next few years. Hopefully when COVID's gone, we'll still have a lot more remote follow-up to make it easier and more accessible to patients as well.
I think that's right, Carmen. And this whole thing with the COVID has forced us to innovate a lot more. And we should be making research as easy as possible for people to participate in. And actually, I think we are learning that we could make it a lot easier for them. If they don't actually even have to attend potentially, to take part in research, or we can send sample collection out to them, and all these sorts of things we're now looking at.
And I think that's, again, enthusiastically, we as an organisation, we want to work with yourselves on that basis, particularly, not exclusively, but particularly for this extended work into relatives and family. These people are not necessarily going to be attending clinics, so to be able to do it in those places is a real positive.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yes. I mean, these are not even patients, right? These are people without any condition. So to expect them to sort of come along to a hospital and have a lot of tests sometimes is probably too much to ask. So we're trying to make it as easy as possible for people to participate.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together, and before we do the next steps, then recruitment. If people are interested in knowing more about this study, the cohort study, whether it's a patient with pulmonary hypertension who's new to pulmonary hypertension, think, am I in this or not? Where can they get that information from? Who should they speak to? And as far as this sort of potential of family members being interested, where next for these people?
So if you're coming to one of the PH designated hospitals, you can have a chat with your nurse or your consultant. But also we have a website, iphcohort.com, that has pages on there, just sort of generic information about the study. Then it has a page on there for patients, and then also a page on there for relatives. And we are recruiting controls as well. So it's got all the information on. So we haven't
come out. No, it's fine. You say we're recruiting controls. What's a control?
So we're also recruiting controls, which will help us with our analysis. So that can be anyone who doesn't have pulmonary hypertension. Right, okay. It could be if someone goes to clinic and they've got pulmonary hypertension and they bring their spouse with them, they can obviously give us a blood sample as well. It's just a one-off blood sample. So when we come to analyse the pH samples that we have in our biobank, we've got some control samples which we can see the difference. This is what happens in a pH patient, and this is what happens in a control, or what we would call like a normal patient, and we can see the differences. So all that information is on our website. The contact details for myself and Jennifer on there are our email, cohort coordination, and also the details of the nurses at each centre as well. So I would point people in that direction. If they're interested, they can just phone us up, talk through the study. If they want further information, we can send it to them as well. Okay. So
I mean, it might be good, Carmel, as well, once we've completed this, is if you speak to the team in the office, etc., we could revisit our website as well and probably enhance your presence on that website and directing.
No, that'd be great. I mean, you've helped us in the past, but like we're saying, we're trying to engage the relatives, and sometimes that's quite difficult. So what happens at clinic is if we see a patient who has a family history of pulmonary hypertension, we would approach them about talking to their relatives, and we give them a slip of information and they can give that to their relatives. But we want relatives to come straight to us as well, so that we can recruit as many relatives as possible. So even, it's worth giving us a ring and chatting through things with us, and we can point you in which direction. So even if your family member who has pulmonary hypertension is seen at Newcastle and you live in London, we can see you at one of the London centres. And also we're looking towards sort of remote follow-up of our relatives as well. So we can, no matter where you live, there's a centre nearby, or we can follow up relatives remotely to make things as easy as possible.
That's excellent. I mean, that's really good sort of points there, Carmel. And as I say, I think in the new year we will visit if you definitely to do this. Nick, as a roundup, what's your take-home message as far as this understanding of genetics in PAH at the moment, where we've come from and the future?
Yeah, I think we've come from a position where there was nothing known about the genetics of PAH 20 years ago to now recognizing that something like a quarter to a third, so 25-30% of people with what looks like idiopathic PAH actually have a genetic cause for their disease, with implications for them potentially, but also implications for their families. And it is the sort of international guidelines now do say that all patients with idiopathic PAH should be offered genetic testing. We probably don't yet have that in place throughout the UK, but that is a real aspiration on the clinical side, that we're in a position to offer that to everybody with idiopathic PAH within the next year.
Okay, and I know this isn't a sort of, I'm slightly going back a little bit, Nick, because what you've just said, is this just for people with idiopathic? What about, is there other work being done in congenital heart, or is that too complex to answer at the moment?
Well, it's a very good question, and it is too complex to answer at the moment. I have to say there is emerging evidence that, yes, certainly with the congenital heart disease associated PAH, there are genetic drivers there too, but most of the genetic information that's sort of, more readily attainable is in the idiopathic PAH population. Of course, the hope is that, the discoveries that are made in these idiopathic groups or familial groups will provide new insights into the disease, which is relevant to all different forms of pulmonary arterial hypertension. But at the moment, the focus is on the idiopathic group.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, well, Nick and Carmel, thank you very much for your time. As I said, we look forward to working with you in the next few years, specifically on this project, and it will be good coming out of COVID to have conversations about other things than COVID, and very positively looking about changing the course of this disease. Because I mean, I've learned a lot, and I'm involved in on a day-to-day basis with pulmonary hypertension, the size of the work that's being done, what's happening. I think it's really exciting. I think it's a thing that's kept me in pulmonary hypertension for 25 years, is working with people like yourself. So on behalf of all the patients that we see in our membership, I want to thank you and Nick for all the work that you've done in your team, particularly those who work in in the background, like in biobanks and stuff like that. I know they don't get the opportunity sometimes to meet patients, but they're definitely making a difference to people's lives. So passing our thanks to those people as well.